Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait another minute. We've got 24 participants, but the number is rising. So we'll start in just 1 minute. So welcome everyone to the first seminar in the Food Eye seminar series. And each month we will be inviting world-leading experts in food systems research to come and talk to you about a wide variety of subjects. So for those of you who don't know, Food Eye is an all-Ireland food integrity initiative, which kind of consolidates food systems expertise right across the island of Ireland. So bringing together academics, industrial scientists, government stakeholders, to discuss science-led solutions for an equitable and sustainable food supply. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our first speaker of the series, and today's speaker is Professor Alison Bentley, who is Director of the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Centre's Global Wheat Programme. She's based in Mexico, and her team use world-class scientific approaches and plant breeding to develop improved wheat germplasm. Prior to joining the centre, just over 2 years ago, Alison worked in the UK, focused on the translation of fundamental scientific research into tangible impacts for the agri-food system. So as we all know too well, Russia's war has highlighted the fragility of the global food supply and the absolute critical need for sustained investment to feed the world in this changing climate. So Alison will focus on wheat and talk to us about the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on wheat supplies and, importantly, the pathway to greater resilience. So Alison, over to you. And please, if you have any comments, please add them into the Q&A box and we will get to that at the end of the talk.
Thank you very much, and thanks for joining. As in the introduction, I'm going to be talking about the wheat-specific impacts of the Ukraine-Russia war, but also how these fit in a greater context of supply and our global food systems. And I think the point from the introduction is really important in terms of the Food Island Initiative as well, in how we really develop and sustain equitable food systems. And that's very much the focus of our work here in Mexico and globally. So I'm going to talk about both the impacts of the current Ukraine-Russia conflict, as well as the pathways we're proposing to greater resilience. And I've used this image, which I've just created, because I think throughout history, there's been a link between agriculture and conflict. And this is really at the heart of what we see now, and really at the heart of what we need to address in terms of the stability, not only of the food systems, but of our systems of global governance and how we operate. So why wheat? And I will focus today on wheat, but hopefully some of these lessons are more widely applicable. So wheat is really pivotal to alleviation of global hunger. And this is in the current status of how our agricultural and food systems are set up. And obviously very happy to discuss the role of dietary diversity and the role of our cereal staple crops, because we do know that having a small set of staples in place to alleviate global hunger is a fragile scenario for delivering food security worldwide. And really the work at CIMMYT is focused on the SDG 2 of zero hunger, so how we achieve zero hunger, and at the base of this is provision of daily energy. And in this map here, you can see in red the countries in the world where wheat is the #1 source of dietary calories in the human diet from plant-based sources. So we can see there's a lot of red on this map, both in the global south and the global north. So here we really see where wheat plays a role as the foundational element of these food systems. And then interestingly, in countries like India, China, and sub-Saharan Africa, if you did this graph and showed maize or rice, you would see this entire map turning red. So we really are reliant on just a handful of cereal staple crops of which wheat is a major component. So here at CIMMYT, we're based in central Mexico, and we run a centralized breeding program, a genetic improvement program, which serves the world. So over 50% of the world's wheat is produced in the global south, where there isn't private sector investment. There aren't really highly sophisticated, in some cases, seed distribution systems. We have a really unique setup here in Mexico, where we're able to use shuttle breeding, which was brought in by Norman Borlaug, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for the work around that. And we breed 2 cycles a year using the geographies of central and northern Mexico. And this is not unique in itself to use the geographies of a country to breed, but the unique part is that the centralized breeding operation allows us to breed broadly, widely adapted material for our target geographies throughout a very large area of the world. So Latin America, Central, South and West Asia, and Southern and East Africa. So we have a system which allows us to breed and select for wide adaptation across very diverse geographies where wheat is grown. And this is very effective because it allows us to have a concentration of our breeding effort, a concentration of the science that we do, as well as the economies of scale that come with being able to centralize an operation. So our program, our breeding program, our genetic improvement program targets over 50 million hectares of global wheat production. And these are all in the global south. So we're really aiming to deliver global public goods through wheat improvement and make these available to smallholder farmers. And smallholder livelihoods are really our target in terms of our breeding objectives. So wheat for the world. So wheat is grown more widely than any other crop. And you can see here in yellow and the other colors here, the regions of the world where wheat is grown. So wheat is really unique in that it broadly adapts to different eco-geographical conditions and can be grown really broadly, widely across this geographical space. We can also see in this map, which shows wheat production. So we have areas of the world with high wheat production. So you can see here in Northern Europe, we have really high levels of wheat production on per unit land area. And likewise in the northern parts of India and Pakistan, parts of China and the US, very high, very favorable wheat production, as well as some parts of Australia. But we can also see that wheat production in the light yellow color is also low, below the theoretical optimum in many parts of the world. And this is part of what our program does, to say we're already producing wheat on this land area, but we want to enhance or boost that production because we know it's possible to do so through a package of agronomy, varieties, management, infrastructure. And so we want to be able to sustainably intensify or use this land area, which is already used for wheat production, already has a supporting infrastructure around it to optimize our wheat production. And this is really relevant in the current context of today's challenges. And in particular, wheat has been central to the coverage as well as to the impacts of the Ukraine-Russia war. And we really see changing geopolitics having a really large impact on food security and on wheat specifically. And this provocative cover of The Economist, I think, really showed that wheat is really a central lever or central instrument in the current conflict. And it's not the first time that we've seen wheat as a component of the food system leading to social unrest. And also the knock-on effects of that for food aid and extreme food instability around the world. So these are really relevant in terms of wheat and the work that we do here at CIMMYT, but also the global context of our food systems. So if we look at food price index, and I guess this is my justification for talking about wheat, although it's really core to what we do. If we look at the food price index, which is shown in this graph in green, we see that the food price index, or how much people pay for food, is very closely linked to both the price of cereals and oils. So we can really see that cereals are a big driver of how much it costs for an individual or a household to purchase food. So these are really closely linked. We can also see through recent history the spikes that have occurred in our food price index, so with food becoming suddenly more expensive, and then placing a burden on the communities, particularly vulnerable communities who have less ability to absorb these price increases. So we see in 2008 and 2011 well-documented food price increases, which had social and political consequences. And then we can look at the current situation, the invasion of Ukraine, and really this huge, again, jump in the food price index. And with Russia and Ukraine as big players in the sunflower oil industry, this spike in oil, and also the corresponding spike in cereals. Just to say, this is agricultural food prices, so we're not talking about oil that's used for other purposes, but obviously that has had big impacts and has been well documented as well. And so if we look at the history of these food price spikes, we see the food riots of 2008, particularly throughout the Middle East, and the Arab Spring on the back of this, or partially linked to this, where there was violence in queues for subsidized bread, really, which is the foundational component of the household-based food system in many of these countries. And likewise in 2011, particularly in parts of Africa, really non-availability of basic cereal foodstuffs, leading again to societal unrest. And so this is really the context where we look at the recent increases in food prices, a reduction in supply, and we see the potential for this to lead to significant instability, both in terms of the food system, but then in terms of the communities that the food systems sustain. And through our work at CIMMYT, we've been really trying to highlight the potential for these impacts. First in this commentary in Nature relatively soon after the invasion of Ukraine, to really highlight that some of these impacts, many of these impacts are going to be inequitably felt. So the households in the global south, food systems in the global south are much less able to absorb supply reductions, price increases, and this has significant implications for the food security, the food sovereignty, and the stability of these countries. We've also more recently published this solutions agenda, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail today, bringing together multiple disciplines to really try and identify near to long-term measures to stabilize our global wheat supplies. And here, stability and resilience are really important. And what I'll highlight today, really how we build more resilience within our global wheat system. And then this has obviously implications for the wider food system and how we ensure food security equitably. So we can look at for the shift of text here, we can look at the current situation and the wheat supply that we see in the global market, and then ask some questions about why we saw such significant impacts on wheat in the invasion of Ukraine. So in this map at the top, we can see the concentration of wheat exporting countries. And this has occurred relatively recently. And we see from this map a real concentration of export supply in North America, Ukraine, Russia, Australia. So really a small number of countries and some parts of Northern Europe. So we see really a small number of countries producing the wheat for global export, and this real concentration of supply. If we look at the other side of the coin, so who needs to import wheat, we can see that most of the importing countries reliant on this very concentrated source of export supply are in the global south. And we can look in more detail on the right here at who is buying wheat from Ukraine and Russia. And a lot of it's going to the Middle East, also to East Africa, and to other parts of Asia, South Asia in particular. So we see immediately the vulnerability from having this relatively small number of suppliers in the game and relatively large number of countries or regions dependent on this supply. And it's worth also noting that this supply has been very low cost over the past few years. So it's been relatively cheap to buy wheat, and it has been available in the global market. So we have a few players able to provide cheap wheat to the rest of the world, and this has been the basis of the staple food supply in many of these countries. And we see concentration of supply not just in the wheat trade. I think we see this in many different parts of our daily lives. And I take here the example of our retail sector. So I think we see that many of us probably used to go shopping on a high street, and now it's very convenient to open a web browser and concentrate your supply of all the things you might possibly need through a single interface, and then have that delivered to your door. So this is not just something that we see in the wheat market. We see this in many different aspects of our lives, that we're really reliant on concentrated and increasingly concentrated supply of the things that we need in our day-to-day lives. And that's fine, and it's great, and I'm sure we all enjoy and really value this kind of concentration of supply and the ability to buy things, to have just-in-time delivery. I want something tomorrow, I click a button and it arrives. But it does have implications for the rest of the system. And just as we see that countries in Africa are no longer able to buy wheat on the market, we also see this in places like our high streets, where we have then reduced choice and reduced availability. So when something that we want is out of stock, we suddenly have an issue with being able to access it. It's worth noting that, again, this is not just in the wheat system or the retail sector, but we see this in microchips. So if you've tried to buy a car, you will potentially have experienced a delay, because, again, the concentration of microchip supply over time has meant that we have really a low level of resilience in our system. And this is really core to kind of the concerns that we have here at CIMMYT, that when we concentrate our supply, we create this vulnerability and lack of options. And that's really a big question. Should our food system be dependent on just-in-time delivery? Should our food system be dependent on trade? And the assumption that trade is always possible. And I think there are some questions we need to ask here. There are also questions on the equitability of the current model of a few countries producing the supply and then other people buying it. And we see over time big disparities emerging. So in Europe and North America, actually the reliance on imports from other regions of the world, cereals in this case, has become less. So less dependency on imports. Whereas in Africa and Asia, where the majority of vulnerable communities live, and where we're really struggling to meet our sustainable development goals, the reliance on imports has increased over time and is forecast to increase even further to 2030. So we see this disparity. Not everyone's reliant on this concentrated source of imports, but some of the most vulnerable countries and regions of the world are. And we see this in Africa. So this graph shows here the wheat production in Africa, which has stayed stable over time with some shifts. But we see a huge increase in demand for wheat. And this again is linked to things that happen in society. So here is linked to urbanization. As we see greater shifts to urbanization, we see an increasing demand for wheat. And this has resulted in this growing gap between the production that's there in the local regional context and the reliance on imports. And we expect this to increase over time. So here we have to ask the question, really, do we want production to stay stable? Or if we are seeing these increases in demand, do we really need to have a corresponding increase in production? And how do we deliver this and incentivize it? And whose role is it to do? But here we really highlight this growing gap in many parts of Africa and Asia in particular, between the production that currently occurs and the demand for wheat, which results in this very large import gap. So what does this import gap look like in reality? So this is the port of Mombasa, which is the intake port for grain into East Africa. And so this is a very typical picture on the left of what would happen of large ships coming with cheap wheat from Russia and the Ukraine. And this is obviously offloaded at the port. And here in the port, all the infrastructure exists for processing that grain. So you see these silos in the background, very highly sophisticated infrastructure, which is really designed for import of cheap wheat from other parts of the world. And it was the situation that these boats would be arriving very regularly. So this was really underpinning the supply of wheat in East Africa. And then if you go to the biggest mills in East Africa, you can see the composition of the wheat grist. This is the components of the flour, which then go into the processing sector, either for home use or into the bread and bakery factories and facilities. And you can see this reliance on wheat from Russia and the Ukraine in these grists, over 60%, with local production only making up percent of the wheat grist. So this situation today looks very different, with no boats arriving in the port, no grain in these silos, and really a big question about how do you actually provide an additional, how do you actually find an additional 60% of your wheat grist to ensure food security for wheat-based products in East Africa. And this is a really big and real impact of the current crisis. So as I mentioned, we have just recently laid out a response agenda, which is what we're proposing as some of the pathways to build greater resilience in our system. And obviously building resilience is not necessarily a short objective. So in the short term, we're proposing really mitigation actions. So how do we really bring solutions to the immediate need for wheat in different parts of the world? And I'll go into these in some detail, but boosting production, ensuring access. So boosting production is a biophysical objective. Ensuring access is about market controls, market interventions, prioritizing food versus feed. A lot of wheat in the global market is used for animal feed. Really asking questions about how we manage that given the demand and the current situation, and then securing supply. So how do we make up for these empty silos in East Africa? What's the mitigation measure to ensure we can still provide wheat-based products to consumers? Then in the medium and longer term, we look more towards a resilience agenda. So we're looking at targeting expansion. I showed that graph, that map of where wheat's produced. Those are the current areas, but there are additional areas which are suited to wheat. But obviously we need to do this within the context of our sustainability goals and our agro-ecosystem diversity. We also want to build more comprehensive self-sufficiency pathways. Again, in the map I showed earlier, there are a lot of regions of the world where wheat production is suboptimal, but we know we have the packages of varieties, agronomics, mechanization, to increase production. And so providing those as packages of solutions to farmers, farming communities at regional and country levels is a high priority. We also see the need for monitoring capacity, so the ability to be able to visualize in real time global wheat production, because this allows us to identify risks that have impacts not just on that region, but as I showed from this concentration of supply, that have potential impacts or implications for the market. And monitoring capacity is really important. It's really important to have transparent data. And NASA Harvest have been working on this to try and really generate maps on a monthly basis of where wheat's being grown, by who, how's it progressing? Is it green? Is it orange? Is it red? Are there potential issues that will result in reduced production? And then how does the system absorb those? How does the system prepare? And how do we avoid these price spikes, which are due primarily to reduce supply? Then in the longer term, these are not long-term objectives. Obviously, we'd like to have them now, but we really believe that some of these are longer-term goals in terms of the resilience agenda. And the first is how we achieve increased production within the context of our sustainability goals, how we maintain agro-ecosystem diversity, and how we balance these two things. I think in the political landscape in different parts of the world, there are lots of different discussions about the role and the priorities of agroecological diversity within our agricultural and food systems. But we need to be able to balance these and have rational discussions about how we prioritize production versus sustainability or ecosystem targets. And doing this more holistically than on a specific country basis is potentially useful. We also see that there are growing gender disparities in agriculture and agricultural production and in rural communities. And for example, we know that when staple food production becomes, when the price of staples such as wheat become higher, there's shift in household decision making. So a shift to grow something which is more valuable, and then that decision making process and the control of income changes. So here we see really a great need to generate data and to understand more about how some of these other changes that we're proposing could impact on gender roles within a household, also within rural communities and within wider regions. And then the final point, which I'm sure no one will dispute, is that these are long-term, that building resilience is a short, medium and long-term objective. And we need to have an investment model which really speaks to this and allows us to work in a more sustainable manner in terms of the investments that are made in securing our global food security and our global food supply. So now just to talk briefly about some of the things that we're doing here at CIMMYT and how these link to our response agenda. And our program is really biophysically focused, although we're trying to bring in much more understanding of demand and how changes in the market, such as we've recently seen, can be mitigated or can be addressed through a combination of biophysical research as well as social science, markets and value chains, and trying to link all of these things together. So I'll just quickly highlight 3 of the programs we have running at the moment. The first is on boosting production. Obviously, as biologists, this is is our core business, and we're really working to increase the genetic potential of wheat. We're serving over 50 million hectares of wheat production worldwide. So if we're able to increase the genetic potential of our material, we believe we can have substantial impact on really a large amount of the world's wheat production. We're also looking more upstream at how we safeguard our production for the future. We know climate change is also there, also having real-time impacts on wheat production. So we are looking really into the science of how we ensure greater resilience in the genetics that we provide in future. And then new work, which I mentioned briefly, is on securing supply. So how do we actually address these empty silos in East Africa? And we're doing this through the use of blending, so blending wheat and other cereals, and providing this all the way through to the consumer and policy interface to really mitigate the current crisis. And so, as I said, boosting production is really important. We know many regions of the world have suboptimal wheat production, and we know that over time, through breeding, through integration of good genetics, we're able to increase the genetic potential of CIMMYT material, which is what's shown here, both in our research stations as well as target environments shown here for India. So we've invested significantly in accelerated breeding infrastructure, which is shown in these pictures here. So we have 2.5 hectares of semi-controlled environments, and we're really trying to speed up the breeding process. And we're trying to speed up the breeding process because that will allow us to deliver better genetics faster. And therefore provide material which has a higher yield potential more quickly. We're also using speed breeding and other techniques to specifically incorporate disease resistances, other traits of interest. So we make sure we're also providing, as well as providing material with high genetic potential, we're also providing a full package of disease resistances, in this case specifically focused on diseases. And then if we look a bit more upstream, as I said, about some of the future resilience that we know we're going to need in wheat varieties for the future. We're doing this through the Heat and Drought Wheat Improvement Consortium, as well as a partnership on enhancing yield using novel traits and novel germplasm. And the reason for doing this is about safeguarding production, again, building resilience. And if we look at predictions of yield declines due to climate change, again, we see most of these impacts are likely to be in the global south. So in this image here, anything in red, orange, or yellow is a predicted yield decline in wheat production due to climate change effects to 2050. So we can draw a line through the world and see that most of these are likely to occur in the southern parts of the world. And this is where really we see the most vulnerability in our agricultural production and food systems. And actually we see quite significant predicted yield increases in the global north and other parts of the world. But some particularly worrying projections here, such as the northern part of India, which is a very significant breadbasket of Asia, really predicted to have very significant yield decreases due to climate change. So this highlights regions where our wheat production impacts are likely to be greatest. And this allows us to think today about these challenges of tomorrow and how we address them through breeding, through adaptation, through mitigation strategies, and is really important for the long-term resilience piece. And this work at the moment for us in the CIMMYT program is much more upstream of our breeding pipeline. It's about saying how do we identify and incorporate into our breeding programs the traits of the future, and specifically for heat and drought stress, which are the major limitations that we are already starting to see, but that we know we'll see more and more in future. So a lot of this is based on fundamental genetics. How do we understand how this genetics gives us flexibility, gives us a way to respond to challenges. And we do genetics at different scales, which is a really nice thing here in the CIMMYT program. So we can do genetics on small numbers of plants, but we can also scale it up to the field level. So we have a breeding station in Ciudad Obregón in northern Mexico. And here we really try and apply this science at scale to really identify material and create new material that's then shared with this global network, which is shown in the small map here. Because we can then distribute this material to partners throughout the world and understand the potential of these future traits in these future environments. So we can use climate analogs to understand how these traits perform in different environments and different cropping systems. So finally, I'll just mention some of our work on securing supply, which is really exciting new work for us. It's obviously not exciting that we have to do this work in direct response to the current situation and the current shortage of wheat in East Africa. But here we're really lucky to be able to mobilize resources through the One CGIAR, our overarching organization, to deliver this new work, which feeds in both to ensuring consumers have access to wheat-based products, but also that policymakers have technical data underpinning their strategy for mitigating the current crisis. So just briefly, what we're doing in this work, which was initiated in April and May in direct response to the current crisis, is developing and testing new flour blends in East Africa. And the reason to focus on East Africa is largely because of the impacts of the current crisis and the dependency on East Africa for wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. And that's shown here for Russia in the top and Ukraine. So we see a large portion of East Africa really dependent on these wheat imports. We also see at the same time increasing wheat consumption, peri-urban, urban populations really becoming more demanding, more reliant on wheat. And local production has declined, and it's declined primarily due to the low price of wheat on the global market. So if you can buy something really cheaply elsewhere, there's very little incentive to actually produce it yourself. So here in East Africa, we see the production to import gap being largest, which is why we're focusing in this area. And the milling and processing industry has been dependent on cheap imports, and now those are not available. So we ask the question, can blending alleviate supply and price issues and still provide what's demanded by the market? So our goal here is to replace imported wheat by locally produced crops without impacting the flour quality or consumer evaluation. So here we're not so much interested. So blending has been around for quite a long time, obviously. It's used in many different crops, many different scenarios, and is previously really focused on the nutritional components that can be achieved with a blend, and is very much part of the health and nutrition aspects. But here we're asking, can it actually be a mitigation for price increases or reduction in supply? And so, as I said, this work is underway, and we're working with the industry to source and commercially blend wheat with millets cassava, sorghum, different locally produced crops, also as a way to drive demand for some of these better locally adapted and produced crops. We're then looking at the technical evaluation. Can we actually make final products, bread, chapatis, mandazis, and how do we actually achieve these, make sure we can create actual food products, and then really importantly, looking at the consumer evaluation. And here we're not saying, do you like this more than you like your normal loaf of bread, but actually can a consumer on a street corner in peri-urban Nairobi taste the difference between a blended wheat product and a pure wheat product. So here we're really interested in, can we use this without impacting on the consumer evaluation and the demand for wheat-based products that we see already happening in these areas of East Africa. So this is exciting new work because it allows us as plant breeders to say, actually, what we want to know is, does the consumer demand it? Is there a potential to provide this into the market? And then how do we work backwards to make sure we're providing the correct wheat to feed into this system? So just to summarize, we have proposed this response agenda, which has many different components, and primarily within the CIMMYT program, we're working on some of the more short-term aspects of that in terms of boosting production where we know it's possible to do so. We're also looking to the future in terms of safeguarding the production, so how we ensure wheat is adapted for the future, as well as some of these really immediate mitigation strategies through blending. So a question that's not plant breeding based, but can we actually secure supply by using different crops and really trying to deliver this through industry so we can do it at scale. Because if you can substitute 5% of your wheat flour, but you can do it at scale through commercial milling and baking, then you can really have a big impact on price and the availability. So I'll leave it there and very happy to open it for Q&A to answer any questions and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, for a fantastic presentation and highlighting the complexity of the food system and the multidisciplinary approaches that are going to be needed to get the supply to be more resilient. So there are a number of questions in the chat box. Let me just see if I'm competent enough to find them. Oh, yes. So the first question relates to wheat export import supply. And do you mean only wheat for direct human consumption? And I think the query there is, how do patterns change when you include wheat for animal feed, for example? And what are the knock-on effects of the current crisis on food feed competition?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm just looking at, I do have a figure on this, but so the data is not disaggregated in terms of food versus feed or bioethanol. I mean, the bioenergy we can take out at the moment, but there was a time when that was significant. And I think it's a really interesting question on who is in charge of that, who is in charge of saying that this export can only be used for direct human consumption. Because if I was an exporter, I don't have a way to ensure that. And it's one of the proposals that we've made to say there needs to be some sort of policy, some sort of kind of overarching statement or kind of position about when we have significant gaps in supply, export needs to be prioritized to meet food security needs. So it needs to be prioritized for food. I think there's also the bigger question about the competition between animal feed versus human food. And how we do that. But yeah, I mean, at the moment, it's not disaggregated, which I think is really a big disadvantage in the data that we have now. We know broadly how much of world's wheat goes to food versus feed, but we don't have any policy instruments which allow us to say this export is purely for human consumption. The quality classes that exist in wheat mean that if you're importing wheat from Canada, it's likely it's high quality wheat, which you're paying a premium for. So it's unlikely you would feed it to an animal and lose all that nitrogen. But at the same time, it's not mandated So it is really a question, right? Who has the ability to say that I'm exporting you high quality wheat, which could be used to alleviate food security in the Yemen, but I'm exporting it to you as the person who's happy to pay the price. And I'm not telling you whether you can use that for food or for feed. It's really the choice of the buyer to determine that. So it's an area which I think we need a lot more work from the community to come together and to have a discussion, a robust discussion about animal feed in general, the food feed competition, but then how this works in the context of export and import supply.
Brilliant. So another question is, what are some of the gender disparity issues related to wheat production?
Yeah, it's a great question, because for our cereal crops, we don't typically, again, look at the gender components in detail with our broadacre commodity crops versus something like cassava, which is really, or something like milk, which is produced at the household scale for household consumption or trade. And then you have different gender dynamics on who owns the animal versus who owns the produce from it and who makes decisions. We do know that with commodity crops are typically controlled by the male head of household. So because they're higher value crops, which are typically sold on the market, they're not used for home consumption. In the case of wheat specifically, that they are typically controlled by the male head of household. But again, we need to understand that better rather than having a generalization of that. Okay, if it's a broadacre commodity crop, a male will make the decision on the variety, will make the decision on the crop management, and will make the decision on the price point to sell or to store the crop. And then there's lots of complexity in that. And so we've started working with our socioeconomics team on trying to understand at the household level, how are those decisions made? Are they really made by the head of the household, by the male head of the household, or is there a decision-making process within the family? And then how do you, if it is inequitable, how would you change it? So is it just access to resources which is driving that? So if the female in the household doesn't have access to financial resources, are they able to actually make inputs into the decisions? So we're very much looking at it from that perspective, from the household level, who makes decisions, how are decisions made within the household, and then looking at that as a way to design interventions. There's been a lot of work in the past on what are gender preferred traits in a wheat crop, or a rice crop or a maize crop, and this is really difficult because it's in a commodity situation. It's very unlikely that you would see gender specific trait differences, and that's what the data has borne out, that there's really very little difference because you're producing a crop at scale, even in the smallholder context. One interesting component of the new blending work is on the gender differences that we could potentially introduce. So if you blend wheat flour with the flour of millet, and actually it takes longer to cook, then that will usually equate to longer food preparation times, more fuel collection. So we're trying to design these strategies with this in mind, and trying to collect this data. Okay, does that actually change the functional property? It would take longer to prepare in the household, and therefore place an unequal burden on the female who's typically doing the food preparation. And so, which is really cool. So we're doing a lot of the consumer testing with home use testing as well. So giving people flours to take into the home, and to really try and assess some of these things actually in people's homes, within households, and within family groups.
Fantastic. So another question is, many countries are trying to sort of minimize or wean themselves off Russian and Ukraine supplies, for example, of energy. Will this be possible for wheat?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think so in the short term, maybe not, because wheat takes 7 months to produce a wheat crop. So we have a time, and we see wheat exports coming out of Russia and Ukraine now, which is really needed for the global market. So in the short term, probably not, but in the long term, it's really what most countries are looking to do. And I think we really propose that we need a regional agenda. So we need, regions to really be saying, okay, where's our wheat coming from? Do we have a kind of coordinated idea at the regional level about how we want to diversify our supply? And that may not be that every country produces. I think someone says the cure for high prices is high prices. We do see like a sudden knee jerk that everyone wants to produce wheat. Even in the tropics, we have people contacting us saying, we want to produce wheat in the tropics. And that doesn't necessarily make sense, because wheat is only adapted to some regions. The cost of wheat, having infrastructure, having ways to process it, having value chains, it doesn't make sense. Does it? Yeah, I guess maybe that's the question to debate. Does it make sense for every country to have this food sovereignty, to produce only the food it needs? And I think that's a broader food systems discussion in many places. But what's the risk appetite? What's the percentage of risk you want to see? And I mean, interestingly, I think wheat is, when you talk about wheat in the global South context, you're often talking about foreign exchange in reality, because you have to have US dollars to buy wheat. So I think it has been a question in the longer term as well about the reliance, the ability to use your forex to buy a staple foodstuff, and if it really is a stability strategy. And while wheat has been so cheap, these conversations have been difficult to have, because it's kind of easier just to keep buying it. So I think we're really at a decision point within this kind of, which has been forced by the current conflict. But then if everyone produces wheat, then the market is flooded by supply. And then we'll again see potentially this vicious cycle of, prices go rock bottom, then everyone stops growing wheat, and then prices, so I think it really is a system perspective and understanding a balance of risk and self-sufficiency and secured supply.
Great. So there's one last question, but also a point in clarity. Somebody missed the maps, and they're wondering were the maps that were created monthly for wheat production, was it NASA data or?
Yeah, exactly. So it's created a project which is called NASA Harvest, and the models are run by an organization called GeoGlam. I'm just trying to again find one. I'm not sure I can find it. So they give a snapshot of, here, I'll share my screen actually. So they just give a snapshot of the current status of world wheat production. So this is an example from February the 28th of this year. Hopefully you can see it. And it shows, for example, the wheat area. So obviously you've got different countries in wheat production depending on the time of year. So you've got out of season countries which aren't represented here. But you can see here in Northern Europe, in the past, so in February, winter wheat in Northern Europe was looking favorable in end of February. You can also see very interestingly in this map here that at the end of February, Northern India and Pakistan also looked very favorable, but we did see a heat wave, a really severe heat wave at the end of March. So this shows that if you looked at this map in end of February, it'd say India is on track for record yields, really good production. But actually, a 1 week of heat extreme really significantly changed this. So I think we try and make the case that you almost need this data on a daily, weekly basis. But you can see here, February 28th, so just after the invasion, that you're highlighting already the risks here of socioeconomic, of conflict and socioeconomic issues are driving this kind of yellow potential watch out. And likewise in North America, we've seen a lot of temperature extremes, temperature fluctuations. We need to watch this. So I think these, see, this is GeoGlam global monitoring data. I think it is really important for us to visualize at a broader scale what are some of the risks. and how quickly these risks change over time as well, and what's predictable. I think interestingly, there's countries where we don't have data. I think China is a significant one where it's more difficult to understand the situation and the scenarios.
Great. The very final question. I know you've got a meeting at the top of the hour, but Kenya have developed national standards for wheat flour blends. How many other African countries have developed wheat flour blend standards and or formalized wheat flour blends?
Very few, and the current Kenyan policy directive is to achieve a 10% flour blend. And I think there are big concerns by the industry about whether you can actually achieve that and still create a product through a particularly industrialized bakeries, which serve a large proportion of the market. So the work that we're doing really aims to feed into that, to say, okay, how would we actually achieve a 10% blend? What would it look like? How would we make sure it's accepted by consumers? How would we make sure that you can actually make industrial scale products? And we, even though we serve smallholder farmers, that's our kind of focus. You know, if you're putting something into loaves of bread, which are then distributed to thousands and thousands of households, that is really a way to achieve scale, and we believe is really important. So Kenya has taken the step to really put in place this policy directive, and we're really working within that to understand what's possible functionally, what's possible actually in the context of making bread products, and do consumers want to eat them? And then in many other parts of East Africa, there's discussions that I think I'm not aware of any other policy directives on blending specifically, but I think we will see them, which is why it's really important that we generate this data as well, to really be able to understand, can we blend? What's the seasonality of supply? What's the capacity of the market to do this? And we're also looking in East Africa, what's the potential for contract production of wheat? So we know we can produce a lot of wheat in East Africa, but with fluctuations in market price, is there an incentive for farmers to actually grow it? So we do hope to fit all these pieces together. The blending work we're starting in Kenya, but hoping to expand into Uganda, Tanzania, and Ethiopia as well. And then into other parts of the world as well, if successful. And I think we will see policy changes coming not just from the supply perspective, but also from the human nutrition, because it allows us to start to ask some of these questions about diversity of food, diversity of what crops people are eating, and potentially create more nutritious products as well.
Excellent. Well, it leaves me to say thank you very much again for your time. What a great first seminar that we've had, thanks to you, to really highlight the complexity of the food system. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks very much.